You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you.
Hello and welcome back to Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here to talk creation and science and Genesis and the Bible. And today, Paul, it's cold here where we are recording. So I mentioned before that I built my little cabin here so that I could record in peace because my office is too close to a railroad crossing, which most of the time now has turned out pretty well. But now here we are in the deep winter, and some Arctic temperatures have come down from the north and froze us out. So I got a nice fire going. I hope it keeps burning for a while. And it's about, I don't know, it was 26 degrees this morning when I got up, which is about -3 for you centigraders. And I've got the cabin warmed up quite a bit now, so hopefully I'll be okay. What's the temperature like there?
Well, probably slightly warmer than that. We did have a bit of a frost last night, and it's a bit chilly, but I'm okay here in the house. I'm not in a cabin in the woods. So.
Yeah. And you don't have a railroad crossing right next to you.
No.
Although I saw the Soham train station is open. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it reopened in December, and I was on the very first train that went out of the station as a passenger service for the first time since I think 1965, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, you're going places, I guess. All right. Well, Paul, I got something in the mail the other day that I thought was pretty cool. It's this. You and I have been corresponding about this book for many years. This is Fossils and the Flood by Paul Garner, with illustrations by Jean Elizabeth. So this is a book how long have you worked on this book, Paul?
I think I began working on it around the end of 2014, beginning of 2015.
Yeah.
So a while.
That sounds about right. It's been quite a journey. So it is. Yeah. I am excited to see it finally in print.
Me too.
You must be. Now. Yeah. Now, so I was reading it last night. It's pretty quick read. It's not super technical. And it's full of neat paintings. There's one right there. Neat paintings, all done by your illustrator here, Jean Elizabeth. Could you tell me? Yeah. Let's start with why did you want to write this? What was your thought process? What was going on in your head when you said I should write this book?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a long story behind that, really, because I guess it goes back even to when I was a young boy. And I grew up loving the kinds of books that reconstructed the history of life from the fossil record. Sure. You know the kinds of books I mean, the books with fantastic dioramas depicting all of these ancient environments populated with these long extinct animals and plants. And in fact, here is one of them. This is a book, and you can see from its condition that it is well thumbed.
Yes, and well loved, I would imagine.
So this was a book that I had when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. It's called Prehistoric Animals: The Extraordinary Story of Life Before Man by Ellis Owen. It was published in 1975. And, I kind of grew up reading books like this. So it's got these fantastic, images of all of these weird animals and dioramas like the ones that you see in museums, all of this kind of stuff. I absolutely loved this book, as you can tell.
Yeah.
And I I've accumulated lots of these books over the years. This is another one that I had when I was a boy, The Evolution of Life in the World of Knowledge series. Again, it's a bit different in style, but you get the kind of idea of the kind of book that it is, with all of these fantastic illustrations. And I love these kinds of things. They really captured my imagination. They kind of set my imagination running. And I think it was books like that that really got me interested in geology and in fossils, and probably influenced my decision to actually go and study geology.
Sure.
I'm sure it was largely down to reading books like these. Now, what's interesting about these books is that, when I'm 5 or 6 years old, I could not understand the text in a book like this.
Right.
The text was way too advanced.
Yeah.
You look at this, that's way too advanced. But it was just the images, it was the illustrations that kind of captured my interest. And I've often wondered, as an adult now, as someone who's a full-time creationist researcher, where are the equivalent books that could inspire similar interest in geology and fossils in Christian young people, but which are written from a creationist perspective? Because, you can tell from the titles of these books, these are written from an old earth and evolutionary perspective. Yeah. So, we've got the story of life before man, the evolution of life. And I've thought for a long time, we need a kind of creationist alternative to these kinds of books to excite the interest of young people about these subjects, but also to offer them a robustly creationist framework to kind of understand the fossil record within. So that's kind of the vision for the book. And I've had this idea in the back of my mind for a very long time, even before I met Gene.
Okay, so you've been thinking about this, and I want to say, that rings very familiar to me. I had similar sorts of books, and I collected them, and I probably have a bunch of them still in a box somewhere. That kind of illustration, that kind of dinosaurs. What kid doesn't love dinosaurs? Somebody goes through a dinosaur phase, right? So so you had this idea in your head for years, probably. And I would say they were definitely inspiring me to become a scientist, right? I mean, thinking about all the sorts of fossils out there and going to museums and seeing them in person, it was pretty exciting. So you had this idea in the back of your head, and what was sort of the catalyst? What was the spark that sort of put this all in motion then? What happened?
Sure. Well, back in 2014, I was giving a talk at my church, at my own church. I think it was a talk about dinosaurs, if I remember. And after the meeting, a lady who attended our church came up to speak to me and said that, she'd enjoyed the talk, and that she had done some paintings based around the stories in the book of Genesis, and would I be willing to come and have a look at them and give us some feedback? So anyway, to be honest, when somebody comes up and says something like that to you, I guess you never quite know, you never know what you're going to see.
Yeah.
But anyway, my wife and I went round to visit this lady, and it turned out that she lived literally just around the corner from us. She was about a 2-minute walk away, just around the corner from our house. So one day we went round, and I remember we sat in her lounge, around the table, and she brought out these watercolor paintings. And when she produced these watercolors, I was immediately struck by how good they were. I realized that this was a very talented lady, that she had a real artistic gift. And, I said, Jean, these are really good. And it turned out, when I heard a bit more about her story, that she'd been trained at art school and that she had done some illustration for children's books, sort of Bible stories and, evangelistic materials for children and this kind of thing. But, I suddenly realized, here was somebody who could illustrate the kind of book that I had in mind. She had the skills to do it. So I think I almost immediately, there in her home, sort of blurted out to her, "Jean, how would you like to work on a book project with me?" And
love it.
So this,
I've had days like
this
that.
kind of, so this kind of led to this sort of developing sort of friendship with her, and then this collaboration. And I'm sure Jean won't mind me saying this. She is a very remarkable lady, and I mean, when I met her, she was well into her 80s, but a phenomenally talented and productive artist. And it was just kind of a joy to to sort of work with her on this project. And so that's kind of how we met. That's how we got started. And I think, well, I believe God brought us together. And enabled us to work together on this project. Wow. She was exactly the kind of person I needed.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. So let me ask you then. I know there are sort of Bible storybooks. You kind of mentioned that Jean had done some illustrations for some Bible storybooks. And I had, the little golden book of Noah's Ark and that sort of thing. So what is that not enough? Is that not enough to spark people's imagination? Is there something insufficient about what we already have that you had to go and get this book made? Or what's going on there? What's wrong with everything that we already got?
Sure. So, of course, there have been lots of books published, written for Christian families, for children and young people that seek to present a kind of biblical perspective on Noah and the flood and biblical Earth history. And they're often beautifully produced and, beautifully illustrated. But I think I was always concerned that they often didn't really get the details right. A lot of popular children's books, for example, about Noah and the flood, tended to sort of turn it into a cute children's story.
They're very cute. Yep.
With the kind of little houseboat ark.
Yes. And the giraffes.
With the giraffe sticking his head out the top and that kind of thing. Yep. So the size of the ark, the likely shape of the ark is kind of all wrong. And sometimes they would kind of portray the flood as if the flood didn't really do very much. The waters rose, the waters receded, but the world looks pretty much afterwards as it did before, and the sun comes out, the rainbow's in the sky, and everything is lovely, everything goes back to normal. Yeah. And of course, I think that's an unrealistic, image of what a kind of worldwide catastrophe would be like. And, we have to remember that the story of Noah and the flood is not we often turn it into a cute children's story, but really it's a kind of horror story. It is horror. It's a story of judgment. It's a story of death and destruction. So I kind of wanted to bring some realism to it. And the other thing, of course, is that on the ark, what would usually be depicted would be modern animals. Yeah. So Noah has lions and tigers and zebras and giraffes and, modern animals. And based on the best scholarship that we have, those are not the animals that would have been on the ark. What would actually have been on the ark are the ancestral representatives of those modern animals. So the ancestral cat that gave rise to lions and tigers and pumas and lynxes and, all of the other types of cats. So I think, those kinds of books have got some problems.
Yeah.
But even creationist books that have tried to correct some of those deficiencies, I think often haven't always got things right either, because they often haven't reflected what's really going on at the cutting edge of modern creationist scholarship. Sure. So even in the creationist books, what you'll find is that Noah and his family, for example, are often portrayed as what I call typical Bible story characters.
Yeah.
So
and oftentimes white Europeans too.
That's exactly it. Kind of white Europeans
in a bathrobe.
Yeah, very modern in appearance. Dressed like fairly standard sort of Bible characters that would actually be typical of dress of a much later period in biblical history. And also, they might try and correct some of the problems with the animals on the ark by including some extinct animals, sort of including some dinosaurs on the ark. But often the dinosaurs would be alongside other modern animals, like we've already talked about, zebras and lions and tigers. Or all of the other kinds of extinct animals that there are besides dinosaurs would just be neglected. They'd just be overlooked. It would just be dinosaurs or something of that kind. Right. So I was really keen that when we did this book, I wanted to better reflect what was actually going on in terms of biblical and scientific scholarship. And I wanted to reflect that not only in the text, but also in the illustrations. So that was quite a challenge, but that was kind of the challenge that I really set for Gene, to raise the bar in the kinds of illustrations that we'd include in the book.
Yeah, so you've raised a really interesting point here, that this idea that these other books are sort of inadequate and they're often inaccurate, and I think some of that comes from just the disconnect that the sorts of people who are very skilled in writing and illustrating and speaking to the world of children are not the sorts of people who are reading the latest geology journals and the latest paleontology journals and keeping up to date on all the latest research. Sometimes they might not even understand what you're saying. So this is a really, really unusual book in that regard, because you have sort of put together someone who knows a lot about the research side of things with someone who actually knows about illustrating and so forth. So how did that partnership work? Was that perfectly smooth and a happy ride, or did you have some struggles at times?
Well, on the whole, it actually went very smoothly. I think we got on tremendously well together. And, everything that we've said so far kind of informed, how Gene and I worked together on the book. So once I'd written the text, and the text, I think, came together relatively quickly, at least the first draft. And I was getting the text reviewed, by other experts. So I was going to other scholars in fields like geology and paleontology and getting them to review the text that I'd written. But I also had in the back of my mind this sort of fairly clear vision for the illustrations that I wanted to accompany the text, and even how things might be laid out on particular pages. I had this idea of these dioramas on certain pages of the book.
Sure.
So take, for example, the dioramas. What I would do is I'd want to try and reconstruct some environment that perhaps existed before or after Noah's flood, and the animals and plants that populated that environment. And what I would do is I would dig out a whole load of source material. So I'd look for some good reconstructions of particular animals that I wanted to include in the diorama. And what I would do is I'd print all of that stuff off, and I'd annotate it. So I put labels on it, certain key features of the animals that needed to be brought out, or how big the animals were, so that we could get the relative size of the animals right in the diorama. And then I'd feed all of that stuff to Jean. And then Jean would go away and she would produce a sketch. She'd kind of do a rough sketch, a crude sketch of the diorama. And then she'd come back to me. I would comment on it. I'd say, look, this isn't quite right. This animal needs to be a bit bigger or a bit smaller. That kind of plant wouldn't really be in this environment. So we'd kind of go through all of that. She'd then go away and she would do either another sketch or just get on with the painting. We also at that stage, again, got advice from other scholars and experts. Right. So, for example, when we worked on the floating forest diorama, we actually went to Dr. Kurt Wise, who was the person who originated the floating forest model. And Kurt very kindly sort of gave us feedback and, made some corrections and made some suggestions about what we should do. So there was a lot of kind of, backwards and forwards between me and Jean and other experts to try to get those details right. And sometimes, of course, Jean would... She was a perfectionist in many ways. She wanted to get these paintings right, and all credit to her. If she wasn't happy with the final product, if she'd done a painting and it turned out that something wasn't quite right, there were times when Jean went away and did a second version of the painting, sometimes even a third version of the painting, to make sure that she got it right. So she had tremendous sort of dedication to this project, and you have to remember that, Jean was not used to working with these difficult scientists,
nitpicking,
who wanted to get, who were nitpicking and wanted to get every detail right. She was used to illustrating Bible stories, and so she threw herself into this, and I have to say she kind of took it remarkably well, particularly when we'd come back and want to make changes, and sometimes she'd push back on things. There were occasional times when, she'd say, do we really have to do it that way? One of the things I know she pushed back on was how we illustrated the people, the post-flood people.
I was going to say that would be problematic for a lot of people, I think.
So she was saying, do we have to put these ugly people in? Because I was kind of asking her to make sure that they had heavy brow ridges and sloping foreheads and all of this kind of stuff. And, so I'd kind of explain to her, and I'd say, well, look, here's what the scientific evidence shows. This is what we're trying to represent. And, and we'd have that discussion, and she'd accept that's where the scientific evidence pointed and what she needed to do. And I think as well, one of the things I really liked about Jean's illustrations is how she put her own mark, her own stamp on these illustrations. These illustrations are not stuffy scientific figures.
They are not.
They're deliberately designed to appeal and draw the reader
I noted when I was reading it yesterday, I noted you have here something I've never seen before, a pink ichthyosaur. Now, all the reconstructions in the stuffy old science books I've ever seen have all have it brown and gray and sometimes a little bit dark blue maybe, but I've never seen a pink ichthyosaur. That's a bold choice.
Yeah.
You let her get away with that, huh?
I did. And the reason I did, and we may well have taken some liberties with some things like that, but sure. I let her get away with it because these drawings, she has got her painting, she's got such a lively style. The illustrations are so attractive, just the fantastic bold use of color. And I think it really just brings it to life on the page.
Yeah.
So sure, we may have taken a few liberties here and there, but I think Jean has kind of added her own mark. She has that style with the bold use of color. She loves all of that, and actually I think it's great because I think it will draw the reader in, particularly children. I think children are going to absolutely love looking at all of these illustrations.
I think so.
And I think that Jean's illustrations are really, in many ways, the making of this book. I've said all along that this is Jean's book as much as it is mine. Yeah. In some ways, perhaps more so. And I'm sure any readers that pick up a copy and have a look at it will agree with that. Jean's paintings really do just make this book come to life.
I'd have to agree with that. I mean, it the text is pretty brief. And what I'm looking at on most pages is those illustrations, and I am stopping to look at them and go, what is this? And then I'm looking at the little key to see that's what that is. Very interesting stuff. Lots of stuff. So can you tell me just, I don't know that you know this, but how many paintings did she do?
It was over 200.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it might even have been close to 210, 220, something of that kind. Now, some of them are single page dioramas or double page dioramas. Some of them are illustrations of particular animals that are kind of cutouts on the page. So there's a whole range of different types of, illustrations in the book.
Sure.
And also, actually, she did far more than 200 illustrations because, as I say, with some of them, they actually went through 2 or 3 versions before we got the final version we were happy with. Right,
yeah, it's a lot. I mean, the book itself comes out about 130 pages, I think. About 130 pages. So it's not a fat book. But yeah, that's a considerable amount of artwork that went into this.
Yeah.
So,
and she worked incredibly quickly. This is the other thing with Jean. She would go away to do a painting, and the next day she'd come back with a painting. She was incredibly fast. Not always that fast, but very often she was. Yeah. So we actually managed to get the bulk of the book done actually fairly quickly, at least in terms of all of the sort of key elements of the book.
Yeah, that's it's impressive. I mean, the work is gorgeous. It's informative. Anybody reading this, parents reading this especially, are going to learn a lot that they probably never would have guessed. So yeah. Well done. So you've got the draft done and the paintings done. That was, you started in 2014, 2015. When did you finish kind of the first draft?
I can't remember exactly when all of the paintings were finished. The text, as I say, came together fairly quickly. I reckon it could have all been within 2015. It might have crept into 2016. I can't quite remember now.
But it was quick.
But that was done. That was fairly quick. Yeah.
So, Paul, it's 2022 now. What happened? What was the big holdup?
Yeah. Well, the main issue was actually trying to find a publisher that could handle a book of this complexity. That was really one of the main issues. You see, putting this book together is actually quite a complex job because there are so many working parts, if you like. You've got the main body of the text. You've got all of the illustrations that Jean did, including the dioramas, but loads of other illustrations as well that all needed to be kind of cut out and cropped.
Yep.
And then all of those illustrations needed captions and labels and keys to identify the various animals and so on. And then there are breakout boxes that add, other pieces of information. So it's a very complex book actually to put it together. This is not like my my previous book, The New Creationism, which is just basically text on a page.
Yeah, this is much more complex, right?
Yeah, it's much more.
And you've got a lot of photographs in here too, to sort of supplement the art.
Yes, there are some photos.
So yeah. This is not what you would send to the typical I'd say Christian publisher that publishes text books of text and maybe a black and white illustration here and there. This is pretty complicated.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that was really what the problem was, because there was one publisher originally. It was actually the publisher that handled my first book, The New Creationism, and they were keen on the book. They loved the book, and I think if they'd been able to, they would have published it. Unfortunately, it was simply too complex in terms of graphic design. They didn't have the in-house graphic design expertise to do it. Got it. And so, rather reluctantly, that they kind of decided that they weren't able to handle it. So, we then had quite a long process of looking for another publisher, and that took quite some time to try to find another publisher that could really take it on. Finally, of course, we talked to the guys involved with Compass Classroom and the Is Genesis History movie,
right?
And they decided to publish it, to take it on under their New Creation imprint. And even then, once we'd actually got that publisher in place, even then it took a long time, because what happened was they gave a lot of good editorial input at that stage on the book, and it went through some editorial changes. So we actually rearranged some of the material in the text. And that also involved me adding some linking material to kind of tie it all together, so that it would make sense. Yep. And all of that took some time. And then when the text was in its final form, that was when we finally got involved with a graphic designer. And our graphic designer was a chap called Ben Kelly. He's got a company called Kelly Creative Design. And anybody looking for a designer, I recommend Ben. He was fantastic. He basically worked on the page layouts, and I was really, really impressed with the work that Ben did. He really got the vision for the book. He understood what we were trying to do. He was able to take what was in my head and translate it onto the page. That's great. And he did that in the most incredible way. He really just captured, what I had in mind, and was able to just bring it to life on the page. And so, I huge kudos to him. I think he did a fantastic job. So I was really privileged in many ways, because I was able to work with a fantastic artist in Gene, and then we had a first-rate graphic designer in Ben as well. So it just really at that point began to come together, and I got really excited about it at that point, because I could see my vision for the book beginning to take shape on the page.
Yeah, finally after all this time. And it's beautiful. You're right. The graphic design is just quite lovely. And some of the little touches here. I mean, he's got these sort of section markers at the top of the page, and they're color coded, which is just very professional. Kind of a silly thing, I suppose, for me to point out in a book like this, but from a graphic design standpoint, bueno. And I know exactly what you mean. Like, I've done brochures and booklets and things like that at Core Academy, where we've sort of had to, you have a vision for it at the start, and then you sort of, when the artwork comes in and the graphic design begins, then the book begins to transform itself a little bit, and suddenly there's more work to do. I get that. I recognize producing a book like this is not just a matter of writing some text and making some pictures. There's this whole other really important realm of turning it into something that's worthwhile and beautiful. And it's really exciting. All right.
Yeah, it was a huge amount of blood, sweat, and tears. I have to say to get to where we are today.
Yeah.
But having said that, I now look at the book and I think it was all worthwhile. There were times in the process where I was kind of banging my head against the table and thinking, why did I begin this process? But looking at it now, I am so pleased with how it's turned out. It's the whole thing has just come together in a fantastic way. So yeah, I'm really pleased with how it's turned out.
Yeah, and we've had many conversations over the years as well. And I've been banging my head against the table too. How is this going to happen? How are we going to get this out to market and at least make it available somehow to people? Because I think it's not a book that is going to appeal necessarily to everyone. But I know there are people out there who would love this book. And I so very much wanted to have copies to make available to them. Finally, it is here.
You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information about any of the subjects discussed in the show, please visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. Are you confused about creation and evolution? Are you intimidated by people who tell you that only morons believe in creationism and that evolution is a proven fact? What if these challenges aren't merely problems to be solved, but an opportunity or an invitation to a lifetime of discipleship seeking God? This is the subject of The Quest, Exploring Creation's Hardest Problems, a book written by me, Todd Wood, and it presents a unique perspective on creation and evolution that encourages faith, commitment, and curiosity in the face of uncertainty. Science and biblical creation walk hand in hand as we explore God's creation. God calls us to experience the joy of questions and the beauty of His handiwork on the quest. It's available today at coresci.org/quest. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org.
So let's talk a little bit about the content. So you mentioned some of the things you mentioned. We've talked a lot about the artwork. Yeah. Some of the things that you mentioned, you talked about sort of the inadequacy of past attempts to produce books like this. Either you have, these illustrators who are not very familiar with the science side of things, and so they've created a children's book that just isn't really not very cutting edge and not really reflecting where creationist research is. And on the other hand, you also have these well-intentioned scientist people who try to do this themselves, and they end up being unreadable, not very attractive. As a scientist, I've produced things like that. It's not good. And I generally, now I'm old enough that I can recognize, well, this is a total failure. We can't release this to the public. So the book has, let me flip open to the beginning here. The book has a nice organization. You start off with a description of the old world, which you describe as the world before the flood. And then you have a couple of a chapter on the world after the flood. And then you just have a little discussion of what fossils are and the sorts of fossils that you will find. So the old world before the flood, what could you say, and how would you say it? How would you know about these things? Is there...
Sure.
Yeah. Where do you get this? Where do you get this stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted I mean, basically, at the outset of the book, I wanted, first of all, to explain a bit about methodology. I wanted to explain how we know things about the topic at hand. And so I talked a little bit about what the Bible can tell us. The Bible kind of gives us an overall framework of Earth history, but it doesn't give us lots of the details. And so we have to turn to science to fill in a lot of the details. So it's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, you know. The Bible gives you the kind of outside pieces, the edge pieces, that are the kind of the boundaries within which you can then sort of start to put the other pieces into place. And the other pieces quite often are details that come from science, from scientific investigation. So how do we know about the old world? Well, obviously the Bible tells us some things. It tells us about creation, tells us about the fact that there were continents and oceans. It tells us about the different things that God made during the creation week. It tells us that it took place over 6 days. Tells us some things about the creation of Adam and Eve. So we have some clues from Scripture, but actually there's an awful lot that we don't have in Scripture. So for that, we go to science. And one of the things that we can do is we can kind of work backwards. So if the fossil record that we have available to us is the result of the burial and preservation of ecosystems that existed before the flood, so it was buried during Noah's flood, and it preserved those ecosystems that had been in existence in the pre-flood world, then by studying the fossil record, we can kind of work backwards, right? We can start to say, well, you know, what can we learn about those ecosystems from the preserved fossil record? And so that's really what we did in terms of producing those dioramas. We're looking at specific biomes or ecosystems that are preserved in particular layers within the flood rocks, and then we're reconstructing what those environments must have looked like in the pre-flood world. Okay. So that's kind of what that section's about. Okay. Really.
So yeah, so this is something I like to try to remind people, because it's a really, I think, big change in the way you think about the fossil record. So the conventional world tells you that this is millions of years of history. The Phanerozoic, the visible fossil record, the stuff with, you know, the shells and the trilobites and the dinosaurs and everything, that's 550 million years, I think, of history, and it takes a long time to produce and so forth. But in the creationist perspective, there's a large portion of that, not all of it, but a large portion of it, that is basically a snapshot of a single, basically a single point in time, if you will. Not exactly, but you know, it's a very short period of time, and it's one world. It's as if we took all the stuff that's alive today and just buried it really quickly. And so it's hard. I think when you've grown up in the culture where everything is millions of years, and these dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, and these dinosaurs lived millions of years before that, and so forth, I think it's a little hard for people to make that transition into thinking about this being more of a snapshot rather than a long film of time, right? So So that's basically what you're doing. So you're taking that idea of the snapshot and sort of, let's say, what can we say then if we have this snapshot of the world at that time? What can we start to say about the things that lived there?
Exactly. So you're absolutely right. So the conventional interpretation of the fossil record is that these various communities of plants and animals that are preserved in the successive rock layers represent successive biomes that existed over long periods of time, you know, over tens or hundreds of millions of years. But in the creationist model, they're actually biomes that existed at the same time, but in different places in the pre-flood world. And because the flood was a transgressive event, so the flood waters advanced from the oceans onto the land, as it encountered each of those ecosystems, it picked them up, transported, and buried them to produce the fossil record that we see today. So the bulk of the fossil record, or a large proportion of that fossil record, represents the burial of that pre-flood world. And that's how we can reconstruct what the pre-flood world really looked like.
So you would go.
So that's
you would go to a fossil. I don't know, a fossil layer. Let's say you go to a dinosaur site, and you notice that there are certain creatures that are present, dinosaurs and things that encountered dinosaurs and so forth. And there are a lot of things that are absent from that layer. And so what you're telling me is, so the traditional story is, well, these are the dinosaurs that were alive at that time, and these other things hadn't evolved yet, and these things had already evolved and gone extinct. But if you're thinking of it in terms of a snapshot, what you're sort of trying to reconstruct in this book, I think, if I got this right, you're saying these dinosaurs lived in a particular place with a certain group of other creatures, and other things lived in other places and got buried in different circumstances. Is that basically the idea?
That's absolutely right. And when we look at those rock layers with the fossils that they contain, quite often they make sense as a coherent community of organisms. So you look in those rock layers and you see you see certain animals, certain plants. We see animals that are herbivores, animals that are carnivores, and we have various kinds of plants, from small sort of bushy plants right up to trees, and you look at that and you kind of see all those organisms preserved in that one rock unit, and it kind of makes sense. It's a coherent ecosystem. And so we interpret that as a particular biome or ecosystem that existed somewhere in the pre-flood world.
Okay.
And you're right, the other communities that we find in other rock layers within the flood deposited portion of the fossil record represent other biomes that coexisted with them, alongside them, but in other parts of the pre-flood world.
So it makes sense, I think, if you think about even today's world. If you were to flood this Earth, which would be really hard now, but if you were to do that, buried the creatures that live in North America, and then buried the things that live in Asia, and buried the things that live in Africa, that would be different, right? You would not find the same sorts of creatures in those deposits, because it's just different things living in different places. And so, yeah, your understanding of the fossil record, as I get it, is that that was a bit more diverse and a bit more I don't know, different in the world before the flood.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we have whole biomes preserved in the fossil record that really don't exist in the world today.
Yeah.
One of them being the floating forest biome that we reconstruct in the book. We just simply don't have that biome. Never recovered after the flood, so we don't have it today. Many of the, if you like, the individual animals, we might have equivalent biomes, but perhaps the animals that fill the particular ecological niches are a bit different in the modern world than the ones that we see in some of the environments in the fossil record.
Right.
So the pre-flood world was incredibly abundant, diverse. There were unfamiliar animals and plants, unfamiliar biomes, but we have evidence of those from the fossil record that we can then use to reconstruct what that world was like. Yeah,
that's great. And another thing I noticed in the book as I was going through it, you also talk a little bit about plate tectonics, which is kind of a big deal when every time there's an earthquake or this horrible volcano in Tonga, or something like that, we hear about these plates are this way, and these things are happening because of plate tectonics. So tell me a little about that. How does that fit into your flood ideas or our flood ideas?
Yeah. So plate tectonics actually has proven to be the key that helps us to understand how Noah's flood actually happened.
Yeah.
At least in terms of a kind of physical mechanism, how it happened. So what we think happened was that at the beginning of the flood, the ocean plates began to catastrophically break away from the Earth's continents and dive into the Earth's interior. And they're essentially sort of recycled into the interior of the Earth as new ocean floor is formed along the mid-ocean ridges, the spreading ridges in the middle of the oceans. One of the consequences of this happening is not only that the continents move around, the continents break. There was probably a kind of pre-flood supercontinent that broke apart.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book.
So that's mentioned in the book, but then one of the other consequences is that the new ocean floor, because it's relatively warm compared to the old ocean floor that's being replaced, it's thermally buoyant, and what it does is it actually causes sea level to rise, and it's that thermally expanded ocean floor, in effect, shallowing the ocean basins that displaces the ocean water onto the continents and results in the global flood. So that's kind of the model that's explained in the section on how that old world was destroyed. And because it was a transgressive event, because the ocean waters kind of rose from the ocean and flooded onto the continents, it picked off those different ecosystems as the flood waters encountered them. And that's how we then produce what we've been talking about, the fossil record right. With all of those, biomes stacked one on top of another.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So at the end of the book, the sort of the last sections of the book here, you have a sort of a review or a summary of the sorts of things, what fossils are and what sorts of fossils exist. I think that's a really nice touch. I mean, this is not just, if you sort of think of it cynically, this is not just a book of creationist stories. You've got actual fossil stuff in here. And the important thing about that, I think, and you mentioned it at the very beginning, is that our understanding of creation and creation science and the flood and the fossil record will change over time. It's changed over my lifetime pretty dramatically. And so, yeah, I think you've got something really valuable here in having all of these sort of the fossils sort of laid out so that, yeah, even as the models change, people can still look back and go, yeah, look at all these fossils. This book taught me about fossils, which is a pretty important thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted people to be able to understand something about the science on which the earlier parts of the book were based. Yeah. In fact, I have to confess, I originally, I mentioned that we rearranged some of the material in the text. I originally had all of the stuff about the fossil record and the different fossil groups at the beginning of the book. And then I kind of told the story about the world before the flood and what happened after the flood. And one of the pieces of editorial input I had, and I think it was absolutely the right piece of advice to give me, very good advice, was tell the story first. As a scientist, I kind of want to lay out all the data and then draw some conclusions. But actually, what's really of interest to the general reader is the story. Yeah. So they kind of want to know what the story is. And then for those who are interested, they can then go to those later chapters of the book and say, okay, what's the scientific evidence that supports everything that's been said in the earlier parts of the book? So we decided to do it that way around because it's not meant to be an academic book. It's meant for the general reader.
That's right. Yeah. So I should mention that. That's a really important point. This book is not intended for scientists. So scientists who sit down and read it may become mildly annoyed at how cavalier you are and how this is just how we interpret things. This is not for us, right? This is to inspire the next generation with really the best we can. Now, at the end of the book, you do have a bunch of references and citations. You don't have, I should say, references, no citations. There are no footnotes or anything like that in the book to tell you where these ideas came from. But there's enough of a bibliography back there at the end that people who are really interested in where did you get this crazy idea, they can look it up and find out where it came from. So it's not.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm sensitive to this because I remember when I released my very first book that one of the really savage reviews basically said, this is all just speculation and he hasn't proven any of this on a particular chapter that was like you trying to tell the story, right? And I remember thinking, it's all in the bibliography, man. Just look, it's right there. It was baffling to me. And so, look in the bibliography, people. Anyway.
Yeah. I made a conscious decision that I wasn't going to include any footnotes.
Yeah.
Because this is not an academic book. It's designed for families. It's designed for the general reader. And, footnotes in a book for the general reader, they're a bit of a turn-off. And to be honest, the average person isn't going to read them.
Yeah.
It's kind of academics and scholars who want to read the footnotes. So you're quite right. What I did was I put a selection of, references in the back of the book that, where people could delve into some of these topics in a bit more detail. But also, we've set up a web page, which you can find at www.fossilsandtheflood.net. And what I did there was I included all of the supportive materials. So for just about every section of the book, I've made annotated comments on, what is the science, what is the scholarship behind the claims that are being made in the book. And I don't know how many references, but it's a very, very long list of references. So anybody who wants that material can find it, and it's there on the web. But what we didn't want to do was put all of that material in the book itself, because we'd have doubled the page length of the book.
Yeah, double the page length for one reader out of 100 who is actually interested in that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
As a kind of a scholarly guy, I'm always going, how could you say that? And then I want to look at the footnote and read the footnote. So reading books takes twice as long for me, but nobody else wants to do that. That's tedious. So, okay. So there you go. That is the book. We're just about out of time here. Tell me where I can get a copy. You've convinced me I have to have a copy of this book. Where do I go? Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon, I believe. You can also, in the USA, order it from isgenesishistory.com.
Okay.
So if you go to the Is Genesis History website and you just click on the shop tab at the top, and you'll find the book listed there among the other products. It's called Fossils and the Flood. In the UK, if you're in Great Britain, it's available from 10ofthose.com. That's 10 as a number, 10, 10ofthose.com.
Okay.
And again, if you just search for Fossils and the Flood, then you'll find it there on their web page for sale. And I guess we can include links in the show notes.
We will, and we'll have it in the comments too. So anybody watching this on YouTube, just scroll down and there will be links to where you can buy this book in the UK or in the US.
Sure. And I think just kind of in conclusion, really, I see this book as a book for the whole family. I think it will work on multiple levels. I think teens and adults will enjoy reading the text, but I think younger children, even if they can't appreciate the text without the help of adults, they'll love the illustrations. They'll absolutely love all of the paintings.
Yeah.
So I think it's got something that will appeal to lots of readers. I think it's a great resource for families, a great resource for home educators, people in Christian schooling, and I think it's a unique book. I don't think there's anything else quite like it. So, my prayer basically for this book is that it will do for many Christian young people what some of those other books did for me when I was younger, that it will inspire them, it will excite them to get interested in science, geology, fossils, and creation research. And, who knows, maybe some of those Christian young people that read this book, maybe they're going to go on to get trained in science and join us in the quest to understand God's creation. That would be
the best
prayer.
Yeah, that's the best right there.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode here. We'll be back in a fortnight. Let me pause briefly to remind you to leave a like on this if you're watching it on YouTube. If you're listening to it on your favorite podcast platform, we would very much appreciate your positive review of our work if you've enjoyed it. You can learn more about the ministries that produce this by visiting coresci.org/podcast. That's where you'll find the home of the podcast, and you'll find an archive of all the episodes there as well. My organization, Core Academy of Science here in the United States, you will find us at coresci.org. That's coresci.org. And coresci.org/donate is where you can make a contribution to making sure that this podcast continues. Paul, tell me about Biblical Creation Trust.
Yes, you can find Biblical Creation Trust at biblicalcreationtrust.org. And again, we're very grateful for your support, any donations that will help us to keep the podcast coming. There's a donate button on our homepage, and if you click on that, it'll take you to a giving page with all of the options, including PayPal and and some other options, particularly for those who are in the UK, but PayPal if you're overseas. And that would be great. Yeah, we really appreciate all your support.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, thanks for this. Well done. Let me congratulate you one more time. It's been a long journey with this book, and I'm thrilled to see it. So congratulations, Paul.
Thank you very much.
All right. And we will see you all back here in a fortnight for another episode of Let's Talk Creation.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.